Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of the server-side rendering tutorial on Turbo 360. In part 1 we set up the user registration and basic auth where we set the session for the logged in user. So basically we just managed user login and registration. In this part we're going to set up the React Redux side on the server whereby we can detect if there's a logged in user and render different UI based on that. So yeah, that's basically it, and let's get into it. So here's where we left off in the previous video. I'm going to run the dev server and make sure everything still works. So let's go ahead and check that. Now we have the admin component rendering right here, and then we're going to make sure that, okay, here it is right here. Now we also have it connected to the user. So what I'm going to do is create a current user reference in the admin component, which is going to be null for now because we never have a current user. But what we're going to do is we're going to render different UI based on that. So if there's no current user, we just say no current user. And then if there is a current user, we render the username. Of course, it's going to always be no current user for now because we don't have any way of getting the current user inside the state. So go ahead and run a Webpack in another window. And here we have no current user, just like we expect. So now let's take care of that on the server side. So at the end of the last video, I showed you how the gulp tasks compile all the React code into ES5 versions over here. Well, it's not really all of it. We're missing one file, the index file, the entry point. And there's a reason for that. That's because the entry point makes a reference to the document, which does not exist on the server. So this will actually crash it if we render this on the server. That's no good. So what we want to do is create another entry point specifically for the server. So let's do server index. And then this guy is really just going to be the same thing. With a few minor differences, but it's going to perform the same responsibility. So we have to import the provider and basically just have it do the same thing, but we want to make a few tweaks. So instead of the rendering the store in here, we're going to pass in the store as a property because this is just a regular component now. And then rather than rendering the admin every time, we're going to render we want to pass in another property called component, and that will render as the child of the provider, so that we can pass in different components based on whatever route we're running. We don't have to do the admin one every single time. So if you open up the gulp file, you want to make sure that this is also compiled into the ES6 to ES5 conversion, transpiling. So server index. And this will be the entry point on the server. So what we want to do right now is run gulp, or run the entire build really, and make sure that that is successfully happening. Okay, so then here in the ES5, now we have the server index, as well as our admin over here. So our React Redux environment is now properly configured for the server. So now what we want to do is actually go over to swing over to the server side. So right here in the index and start using those components. So obviously we need React. And we also need the React DOM, but not just the DOM, the React DOM server, which is a submodule of React DOM. And then here we import our own stuff, our own components. React components. So we want to start with the entry point. So let's go ahead and do that. So server entry. Let's call it server index. Give it the same name, so it's easier to keep track of stuff. So that is in the public dist ES5 root level. So public dist ES5 and then server index. So we have that. And then now we want the container. So we want to do containers, which is dist ES5 components containers. Okay, so these are our React components, basically our code. So now we can render this stuff on the server, which we'll do right now. So first thing we want to do is render the entry point. React create. Okay, but this does require, actually no, let's create the admin first. Let's go with admin, because this is easier. So containers and then admin. So now we have our admin component just as is. But the entry point requires a couple properties. Don't forget the server index has a store property and a component property. So the component property, that's pretty easy. It's just the admin. But the store property is a little bit different. We need to also import the stores now. So store ES5 and then stores. Okay, and then in the store we want to configure. So we're calling, if you're looking at the store over here, you'll see that there's a configure method which basically initializes the store, and we can pass it in as null, the initial state. And then let's go with initial. Okay, and then we can pass that in like that. And that should populate the store object on the server index, this guy right here. Yeah, okay, that should be good to go. So now let's render this as HTML. So HTML equals React DOM server, render to string. And for now, all we're going to do is just a console log, just to make sure it works first. So this rendering API gives you just the HTML as a string. So that's simple enough, right? We can just render it and then console log it, and it should show up as a string like normal. So let's go ahead and run Webpack again, just to be safe. And actually, rather than do that, let's just run the entire build. npm run build. And then turbo dev server. Okay, so it still works, which is good, but now let's check our terminal when we run the index page, and you'll see the HTML of the admin component with the no current user initial state. That's great. So now we can proceed knowing that our rendering is successfully happening. So what we want to do next is insert that HTML in the template itself. So let's go and create a React object and pass in the HTML, and then inside the template, index template, we need to render it inside the root. So right here. So now we have the React code, the pre-rendered code should inject right there on the server side. So we can check the source code and confirm that it's showing up right here. And that's great. So now we have the data showing, the components showing up server side, and then being as well as client side. However, the client side UI is not matched up with the state. Like for example, if you notice on the router, we have an initial state of null, right? So let's go with the initial. Yeah. And then the initial is basically a reference to the store on the server, at least the reducers of the store. And if you look at the store, we have one reducer, user. So we want to populate that on the server side. And the user reducer has all and current user, but we only care about the current user. So let's go ahead and populate that. And let's give it a username of test, right? So we're basically seeding it with some static data on the server, which will then render it, hopefully, client-side. So here, if I, no current user. Okay, so I forgot to pass in the initial into the configure function, so my mistake. Okay, and then if I check this right here, you'll see it says test. You see that? However, the actual rendering shows something different, no current user. So that's a discrepancy, that's not good. And this is a tricky problem to solve. What's going on here is that our server-side state does not match our client-side state, which is this right here. Our client-side state is still null. In other words, the client side is rendering null for the initial state every single time. It's hard-coded. So really what we need to do is take the server-side state and pass it off to the client side as the exact same thing. So it's kind of a handoff from one to another. So what we need to do is go into our index template and create a script and apply a global variable to the window, which initial state is good for that. Initial state. And then we need to assign this on the server side, right? So if we go here on the server side index, we can assign it with initial state. We can get rid of this. And get state, like that. And this function right here just returns a JSON, which is the current store as a JSON object, which we then stringify here. And that's going to be passed into here, which then binds a global variable to the window, which we can access anywhere else. So if I reload this and watch it crash, so initial state is not defined, index line 35, right here, so it's because I spelled it wrong, so there and there. Okay, better. So now if I look at the source code, I will see the initial state down here with the current user of the hard-coded test example that we had earlier. So even though our backend source code shows test, we still don't see it here, so we got to fix that problem right now. So what we want to do is go to our src index, right here, our client-side entry point, and grab that window reference. So initial state equals, and then we can just grab this global object from the window and then pass that into the store. And this initial state right here should be the exact replica of the server-side initial state, because that's the source of it anyway. So now when I reload, I forgot to run Webpack. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to run the entire build. and the server is still running, so let's try it again, and now we have test. So it worked. So now if we look at the source code, you'll see that we have the test user showing up over here and the test in the initial state. So now the client-side state and the server-side state are perfectly synced up, which is good. So now let's go ahead and actually show the current user. If I go to my localhost, users, and current user API, I still have LeBron James is logged in. So really that's the name we want to see here, obviously. So let's go ahead and make that happen. So the rest is kind of just sort of dealing with the session and whatnot like we did before. So what we're going to do is check. We're going to initialize the initial state as an empty JSON object. And then we're going to check the vertex session. Okay, under this conditional, that means we have a logged in user, right? So what we want to do, if we look at the user route, that is this conditional being satisfied right here. So let's go ahead and grab that user. Let's just literally use the same API function. So get the current user. Okay, and then here, instead of rendering JSON, we want to populate the initial state. So we want to get the initial state, populate the user object because that's the reducer we care about, and then there we go. And then we want to populate the current user with the data from the Turbo API call, and then thereby populating the initial state with the data that we care about. And then we can run all this code. Now obviously we're just copying and pasting for now for convenience, but we should refactor this later. Okay, so now the initial state is populated with the current user from the vertex session, assuming we did everything right. And then let's go ahead and check. And there it is, LeBron James, because that's the last person we logged in as. So that's it. It worked. Let's go ahead and create another user and try it out. Auth. So, well, I also created Steph Curry, so let's try that. Okay, so now I'm logged in as Steph Curry. So if I reload this page, there it is, Steph Curry. And then here's the initial state. And here's the pre-rendered data from the rendering we just did. Everything is synced up nicely. And then let's go ahead and refactor this right now because it's really not a good habit to leave stuff behind like this. So let's go ahead and just do that. Get that out of the way. So these lines of code from here to here are basically refactorable. So let's go ahead and do that. So render components. Render component, which is going to be a function. Taking an initial state object as well as a component object, argument, excuse me. So then okay, and here is the component. So rather than render admin every single time, we can just do that. Rendered component, and then we can pass that into here. And there's the entry point, and then we want to create the HTML right there, and then return the HTML. and then we can just use this sort of convenience function. So const HTML equals, and then we pass in the initial state and the component, so containers admin, and then we can get rid of this, and hopefully that didn't break anything, so let's find out. And there it is, so everything still works. Let's check the source to be sure. Cool. All right, now let's get rid of this. That refactoring was successful. And let's reuse it over here as well. Okay, slightly cleaner code, a little bit better to manage. Let's go ahead and make sure everything works in the logged in state, which it does. If I open the browser in Safari, I'm not logged in, so I should get the no current user. And I do. So that's pretty much it. Well, we should do some error handling here. I'll leave that to you, just basic error handling. Or we can even just do a JSON here. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Now the reason I like this setup is because we can customize our pre-rendered data based on what route we're running through, and we can also choose not to pre-render data at all. Maybe there are certain pages that aren't using React, which is happening in this project. So here in my auth route, this is not React at all. This is regular HTML, CSS, templating engine, stuff like that. So that's this route right here. And so I have more flexibility by customizing my pre-rendered logic based on the routes. If you want to follow this paradigm, I would recommend creating a library for these basic functions that'll help your pre-rendering easier in future projects. So that's pretty much it for this demo. Let's just make sure real quick. So here it is again. Let's just do one more. So I'm gonna register one more person. So let's see. Who's that quarterback in? Yeah, Cam Newton. Cam Newton. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so Cam Newton is now registered, and then I'm going to now log in. Cam Newton. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then if I go to the home page, Cam Newton. So there it is.